Yes, it's a sexual orientation, but it's not about just the sex. It is a mental perspective. In fact, that was in what I wrote to kids, is that this has to do with the way I perceive the world and the way I interact in the world. And it's not necessarily just about sexual orientation. It's just the way I view things. It's the way I was born. It's not something I decided. It's just the perspective that's encoded in me.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. Wherever you are on your journey, I hope this podcast will help you feel less alone. Today's guest is retired Air Force Brigadier General David Cotton. He shares how serving in the military made it difficult to acknowledge that he was gay and how he was finally able to embrace his authentic identity. Before I share today's interview, I want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at grayingrainbows.com, and you can subscribe for free in your favorite audio app. You can also get show notes automatically via our newsletter. Just use the link in the show notes or text Graying Rainbows to 33777. That's Graying Rainbows, all one word, spelled with an A. Graying Rainbows to 33777. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. We have a Graying Rainbows fan page on Facebook, and on Twitter, it's at GrayingR. We also have a private group on MeWe, which I'll tell you more about after the interview. David Cotton, welcome to Graying Rainbows.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this.
I appreciate your courage in coming on the show. And as you know, as a regular listener, we start with, you share your story starting wherever you want.
Thank you. That is a challenge of where to start, but I'll just start with a little background. Grew up in Midwest Iowa, small town, idyllic life, great family environment, supportive, vibrant community, had major manufacturing, all the spectrum of professions and business. It was like Mayberry RFD. Kids could play freely, ride bikes all over the place, not a care in the world. Was born in 1959, actually to an Air Force family, and then family moved into Iowa to where we lived for the rest of our family life together. Normal kid, in school activities, went off to college, university, Eagle Scout, focused on community service, and then in college ended up in ROTC and then eventually became an Air Force officer, where I then spent 30 years of my work career and retired from the Air Force as a brigadier general. A social kid, but not too social, always kind of awkward. Considered myself very shy. When you do the personality tests, I'd come out as the guy that liked to stand behind the plants at a party and look at other people, didn't make quick connections really fast, was very awkward. So I was encouraged to get out there, be more aggressive, be confident, and, date to make friends. Had a few good friends, but we're all kind of that same ilk, hung out together in high school and college and just did that. As it relates to, the purpose of the podcast, coming out late in life, and I must say, thank you for doing this. It was one of the many resources that I found when I didn't know what to do. You search the internet, you fill your Kindle with books, you read. I was even reading theses, doctoral theses and studies on sexuality and trying to understand what was in my head. But your podcast was one of the first things I found. And then I was actually really fortified when I saw that guest number, I think 2 and 6, Dr. Lauren Olson, who I've not met, but lives in the same general area that I do, and actually had worked at the university that I was working at the time when this was really coming to the forefront of my head. So it was nice to know that there was a community out there to do that. So people may not let you know that, but I'm sure you have more followers and folks that are supported by you than you may realize. And I found that to be the case in many areas as I dig into this. So in my head, I just kept it all contained. Now, after lots of therapy and the support of friends and introspection over these last 2 years, because I came out 2 years ago to myself and then publicly a little bit thereafter. I'm 61 years old. But the culture that I was in, the society that I grew up in, the times that I did, I just thought what I had in my head was normal for all guys, all men, and just discounted as that. And met a woman, fell in love. We have a beautiful family, 2 adult children. In fact, one turns 25 today, the other's 23. Great experiences, memories in the military. We've lived in multiple countries, traveled together, had a great life and experience, but just kept all that was really in my head that I now know, just contained and just pushed it back. Didn't address it, but I knew where my head was, but again, thought it was just normal. In the military, I served pre-Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to where I very much remember that 2 questions that came up repeatedly during your review of your security clearance and your suitability for further trust was 2 things. One had to do with communism and your affiliation with the Communist Party and the desired or not desire to overthrow the United States government was one line of questioning. And the other always being about homosexuality. Are you homosexual? Have you done any homosexual acts? And I could always say no to those things in my mind. I had not done anything, but I did fear for some reason that somehow they would find out what was in my head, even though I'd done nothing with it nor expressed it. So that was always a constant anxious moment that built up inside of me. Now, it seems silly now, but that was the case in the reality. And it just magnified over time, not realizing that. And I now know that over time, I grew what I consider a mask, because we all wear a mask to hide who we really are. And that mask grew to be, I say, 3 feet thick is what I tell in some groups that I'm in, is that I just put that mask on and became somebody who just really worked hard at work, was recognized for their duty and their commitment. And that's the way they're accepted, because I didn't feel I could make connection and be accepted at a personal friendship, relationship level for whatever that meant. But so it was through my work performance and my zeal to succeed. And I was really average to poor student, actually, not a great student at all, to do that. So I always figured I had to work harder, work longer. So I was always at the office, always working hard in whatever unit or organization I was in the military. And that became my MO. He'll get it done, and he may get it done in a different kind of way. I'm one of those people, if you're a professor or an instructor and you give me an assignment, it's not going to get done until like right before it's due, because it percolates in my head. I've got to think about it. I've got to gnash through it. I've got to analyze it. And then it comes through and then comes out at the last minute, almost like a Hail Mary. Living life that way is not a good way, but that's just the way my brain works. And I would say my journey related to my sexual orientation was just that too, except it was a very long, protracted period to where I took in information, I percolated, I analyzed it, I compared, I contrast, left hand, right hand, which way to go, what happens if I do this, what happens if I do that. And in many cases, I just continued to stay on the track. For whatever reason, I'm not sure, after I retired from the military, we stayed in the Washington, D.C. area, because I was coming out of the Pentagon at the time as a retired brigadier general. Did defense contractor stuff, and then went back eventually to the federal government in the Department of Defense, and was a member of the Senior Executive Service and served as one of the 4 deputy chief information officers to the Department of Defense. Did that for about 18 months. Then we moved to Iowa. My university asked me to come be their first chief information security officer. So I accepted that, worked there for 18 months, helped researchers get their security program together so they could get more grant money and spend it in ways towards the research instead of towards security, in order to kind of bake it in, and had fun at that. But I think the move away from the national defense infrastructure in the federal government may have been something in my mind that gave me more freedom to think, because I no longer had to go through those 2 questions about communism and overthrow the government, nor my sexuality. It was no longer pertinent to what I did. I didn't have a security clearance anymore in those areas, and therefore it wasn't something that I had to take up bandwidth mentally and protect myself from. And I believe I began to think more clearly and more completely and analyze myself. And in doing such, it became then almost a constant thought. In this day where you have your smartphone and you can get connection anywhere, you go to the internet, you go to a private browser and do Am I Gay quiz. You have to try to answer questions. Do I fit this profile? Is there something here or not? I don't know. And just went on for a while. And the more I went, the more pressure built up. I got depressed, really depressed. And when you talk about closeted, we're talking literally in the closet, literally on the floor, not knowing what to do in a ball, just trying to figure out, where do I go from here? So it's that denial. What is it? I'm in this dark cave. How do I get out of this cave? Am I just overthinking this because that's the way I do things? Or am I onto something that I need to take some time and analyze? Didn't have the tools to do that. Didn't have the friends to do that. Had lots of military friends, but that's in quotes. The friends is in quotes. Not good friends that you could just pick up the phone and go through a deep, intimate conversation, personal connection to connection. A few of those, yes, but not that I felt I could really rely on and trust to help me through that conversation. And I must say that I have really learned the benefit of darn good mental health care and the importance of that. And in the state that I live, the lack thereof. I'm still on some waiting lists after 2 years and never got in for some things. Fortunately, though, I found a good therapist while I was living here in Iowa, which we'll get to in a second. So I was in that denial phase, just laying there on the floor, what to do. Plucked about it in my head. I was a security consultant with a small firm. I was actually at a conference in Orlando, Florida. It was 2 years ago yesterday. In fact, last night that came to me that it was 2 years ago yesterday in a hotel room in Florida. I looked myself in the mirror and said, David Cotton, you are a gay man. That's the first time I just accepted it after gnashing through all this in my head that I couldn't get past that fact. And I was surprised at the relief that gave me in making that personal acknowledgement and acceptance. But I still didn't know what to do after that. Now I've done that. Now what do I do? The holy cow, Batman. If you're from the 60s, Danger Will Robinson. So went through that, chewed on that for some period of time. But I do tend to I have a saying that I remind myself is that my ignorance is only magnified by my hubris. You think you have all the answers, but I realized on this one, I couldn't do that. I had to figure out how to figure this out and what to do with that. So I hadn't told anybody. So that kind of chugs through February and I'm into March and I still haven't done that. And I'm trying to figure out, what do I do? I haven't talked to my wife yet, afraid to do that. We had, idyllic relationship. It's a storybook when you tell how we met and when we met and how we were engaged and the trials and tribulations that any couple goes through. Never a fight or argument or unkind word that I can recall. Two beautiful kids that have gone off to excel in their own right. Very successful, overcome all kinds of challenges in that. And my wife was there for them when I was at work in the military, where I was moving around. She was always their advocate, full-time engaged, a son with special needs, which those special needs are his superpower, and is right now about to graduate from university to be hired, and has already been hired by a major national company in his field. He's a software engineer. A year before he's even graduated, they already have him on the books to come, where we concerned whether he even had a brainstem and could see. He's visually impaired, but has overcome all that. Still, not the visual impairment, but the fact that in his mind, he's not impaired. He just operates at a different level and is very successful. So we work through all that. So I'm into March. What do I do? Again, also cognizant of the relationship. I don't want to just blow up a marriage and a family. That's not my intent. I'm the father. I'm the husband. I'm supposed to provide stability. I'm supposed to be the one that has answers. I'm supposed to provide leadership. It's a partnership, but I always felt this responsibility that I had to the family. My wife we're moving around, so she put her work life, she suspended after working 20 years and being successful in her own right to work the family issues. And since I was a senior military officer, there were some things that's assumed that the spouse shall do, because we were still in that kind of cultural transition from where we are today and where we were before, of the spouse almost as the unpaid supporter of the military organization, to where now it's not as required, in quotes, expected is a better way to say it. But the reality is that we have a lot of working couples, so that's just not the case. And it's not reasonable either, because the spouse is not in the military. So I had a friend who's had come out actually 20 years before, and he had been married, 3 or 4 children. I had met him through what became my best friend in the Air Force, and I was like his little brother. And this man actually was part of that extended family for that friend of mine from the Air Force. So I called him, crouched down beside my house on a spring day doing yard work, talking to him to say, what do I do with this? What did you do? And so we had a great conversation. It was so relieving to talk to someone who'd been through this already, because 20 years ago, he had come out. He and his wife had divorced. They still raised their family together. He lived down the street because they had little kids, and continue to this day. His ex-wife recently passed away from cancer, which was devastating for all, but still had a supportive relationship and raised their family together. And so he was very helpful to actually help me through that. And part of his skill, he's such a people person, he'd actually become certified in coaching. And while he didn't treat me that way, it was a good friend to talk to who knew how to ask the right questions to get me to think and then to get me to step through where I was. But at that time, I felt like a guest in my own life. Here I was, considered successful on the outside when you look at the mask, shouldn't have a care in the world, never for want, professionally, financially, family, all perfect, all wonderful. Why would I want to change that? But then in part of this discovery too, I ran into Lauren Olson's book, Finally Out. And he says, people maintain the status quo unless compelled to alter it. They can't imagine a better future, which is where I was, but I was stuck. What do I do? Do I just keep this inside myself? And as I could see, becoming more obsessed and depressed and trying to figure this out. What do I do? So finally, in April, I finally came out to my wife, and it was like dropping a ton of bricks on her. I had years to think about it, if not a lifetime in some way, even though I didn't knowingly see myself as gay when we got married by any means or during our relationship. But for her, it was just like an immediate, cold, emotional, this is a fact, and she had no time to process it. So I guess for those that do approach their spouse, I've heard different stories where some are extremely understanding and no reaction, and they work through it or they had a sense for it. But in my experience, it was just abrupt. And this is not a fault to her. So at no time, if any of my comments are made, they should not be interpreted as me ever faulting her for anything, because that is not the case. She is some would say, the injured party in this activity. She did nothing other than being loving and supportive. I'm the one that was slow to realize. So you go through this denial, then the realization, acceptance, excitement, and then confusion, panic, depression, sadness, guilt, regret, all comes in at once in a wave on both sides for, in this case, husband and wife. And how do you deal with it? And what was one of the things that really got me thinking in April, we were watching something on MSNBC, and Pete Buttigieg was running for president and being interviewed by Rachel Maddow. And he was telling his coming out story and how he decided the life was too short and he couldn't wait. And so when he came home from his deployment, he was going to come out. And Rachel Maddow said something to the effect, I can't imagine how long you could wait. He was like 32. That would crush me or kill me or something like that. And I started to think, man, I'm at this stage, I'm like 58 or 59. I think I've waited a bit to think about this.
But Rachel Maddow is of a different generation. They really have a hard time understanding our generation and older.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And a lot of the things that you find when you look at the internet are geared towards younger folk. Coming out late is like 30 or coming out late is 20. We have kids now in elementary school who are stating their orientation. So fortunately in April or May, then I got my first appointment with a therapist. Oh my God, he was so wonderful. Fantastic, man. Did research actually, which Psychology Today, good resource. Psychology Today, they have a whole section where you can find therapists in your area. You can sort it by what they are, what they think, how they think, what they do. And you really need to do research, because in our process, there was one therapist, not for me, but for my wife, that once she met with him, found out that his perspective was totally contrary to the way she thought. And his basic premise is that I was flawed, and maybe of the old DSM, that I was mentally had problems, and therefore there's no way to help, like whatever, you can't accept it. And that put both of us in tears when she realized his perspective, and she quickly quit him. But mine, I was fortunate. This guy is incredible, young, 32, young family man, small child, starting out his own private practice. You would think, give him experience, but his superpower is his ability to connect and to sense, and his presence in the room. And I'm sure I'm compromised emotionally, because, when someone helps you, you then extend great respect to them. But he helped me in ways that I cannot imagine having come without him guiding and asking questions. So the takeaway there is you need to find someone you trust, a friend, and don't just assume the friends can help you. They're good references, but you need to find a professional. And there's therapists and there's coaches, different perspective. A therapist is going to diagnose and help. And a coach can help too, but they're going to guide you towards something that you're trying to achieve. with interrogative relationship. They seem similar at the time, but their end result and what they try to accomplish might be different. During that time, though, the therapist, Ian is his name, introduced me. The first thing was some reading assignments. Like, great, it's like school again. But it was really cool. It was Brene Brown, and he wanted me to understand vulnerability because he picked up on the fact that I'm the guy that likes to stand behind the plant at the party and not interact with people, and therefore not extend myself to others and be in a vulnerable moment of position. And if I'm going to really deal with what I'm working through, vulnerability has to be a foundational skill. I have to be comfortable with it, and I have to be able to share it. And to some degree, maybe accept it from others, but not expect it, but know how to deal with it when that does happen, when you start to share, when you start to be vulnerable. And it's not always negative. I always looked at vulnerability as a weakness, and it's not. I see it now as a strength and superpower. If you work it right, you need to be empathy at some level, but not too empathetic that you get taxed, but be compassionate and then expect the same in return. And hopefully that's what you get. So he helped me break through that. And then also introduced me to Tara Brach, who has another great book, Radical Compassion, which I use every single day. When you have a feeling, you just don't push it away. She has a principle called RAIN, which is to recognize, why do I feel this way? Recognize it. Just allow it to happen. If you're going to cry, if you're going to laugh. Listening to your podcast, I would be driving the 45 minutes to work, and I'd hear something and relate to that and burst into tears. They might be joyful tears, not just sad tears, because it made me think there's hope by hearing someone else's story. And then you allow that to happen after you recognize it. Then I is investigate, why do I feel this way? To get to the root of whatever is taking place. And then the last is to nurture yourself, to say, yeah, I'm going to be okay. I'll get through this. There's going to be another day. This is not the end. This is just part of the process. So a friend, a good therapist, and be willing to do some work to understand perspectives of others and find some tools. My son at the time in May was working in New York City for a large company there on a co-op, because his degree requires that you co-op about 4 times before you can graduate. Great program, 5-year program, 4 academics and 1 year spread throughout co-ops with different companies around the nation. And so he's living in Manhattan in an apartment. And when we were there, we're walking around. It was a rainy day. Had not come out other than to my wife at this stage and to my therapist. And I wanted to see Stonewall Inn. And it's funny, I reflect back on that now. I walked past the Stonewall and I felt almost embarrassed, like someone's going to see me, even though nobody knows me there except my son in New York City. And I briefly touched the wall and keep on going with my umbrella, keeping the raindrops off. Did that twice. Thought that was kind of silly. Then I went to the Starbucks across the street where I can look out over a little park that sits there across the street, where they have a sign of a national significance for what took place there. And I think when I was maybe 10 years old, I think.
That sounds about right. It was 69.
You're right. And I was 10 on June 27th. And I think the Stonewall, however you want to describe it, protest, whatever, was the next day, I think on the 28th. Because I heard one of your guests, I think it was, what's her name? Fleischman?
Yeah.
Talking about that something had to do with Judy Garland had died that day as well.
Well, it was earlier in the week, but I think that they had just had her funeral or something like that. So that was the timing of it. Yeah.
Because it's strange how certain events lock to memories in your head. And I can see myself in the family car hearing on the radio that she had died. And we're cruising down the road in the Southwest somewhere on a family vacation. Side just comment there. That's a squirrel in a tree. But interesting how memory works sometimes. It's strange. And also, I was in New York City. I saw something on Twitter that Raymond Braun was announcing his film State of Pride, which is still on YouTube, I believe, which is fantastic. Again, I'm crying watching this thing because he's going from small town to small town called the State of Pride, where maybe the Pride celebration is 5 people in a town where you wouldn't think there'd be anybody that would come out to support, but they do. And again, I found that through vulnerability is that I must say I've never received any hate, discontent, or any negative from anybody. So I am fortunate because if anybody has thought poorly of me, they've kept it to themselves. And in this show, he goes through that. But I'd recommend that people watch that. It's really good. How they're supported by their family and friends, celebrating proudly and embracing who they are. That they're not broken, that they're loved. It's really great. But here I am at this stage. I'm 59 or so. And now what do I do with this? Good grief. I'm married in 1991. I'm 59 years old. It's now 2019. Oh, my goodness. And so I looked back at my journals last night. I've got 170 pages of single-spaced typed journals from this whole period. And I wrote at one point in time, I said, how could 3 little words, I am gay, could so drastically change one's life and relationship with the one they love? There, it was all about, how do I deal with this and stay married? That appeared to be the focus, not wanting to destroy that which what we had built together. We were in love. We had a family. Nothing between us was causing this to happen. It's just where I happened to be at my point in time in my life and dealing with it and feeling sorry for her. So now I'm into that sadness, guilt, and regret. And that depression, it only grew because I didn't know what to do. And a lot of my journal is that, just going back and forth in a circle. It's just in a circle, which is why you need that therapist, because they will see that circle. And if not, I have many stories from too many people that I know now to where they did not have that support and they tried suicide as the out and were either caught by somebody or it failed. I had some stories where just their attempt failed, and that is not the solution. All that does is move the problem to somebody else in your absence. So you've got to have a plan, have those 3 people where you've got your phone where you can call them, where you can touch them, you reach out to them. In fact, my current therapist had me do that plan. He has all his patients, regardless of what's going on in their life, download this app on their phone called My3, where you actually preload those numbers in there. So you just hit the app and boom, you dial them up quickly, have them on your speed dial. A friend you can talk to, work through stuff. Don't go that route. It doesn't solve anything. It may seem like it at the time. And I'm listening to a Rick Clemens podcast, which I think I found Rick Clemens, what was it, Life Uncloseted or something, the coming out coach. He tells the story, driving down the interstate. If I just weave a little bit over the center line this way, the oncoming, highway, I guess, oncoming semi could hit me. That would be the end of it all. Those types of thoughts did go through my mind, and you kind of embarrassed and ashamed. But the reality, mine was more of, if I don't wake up tomorrow, I won't care. Or I won't know, for one. And then I want to deal with this. But I never contemplated harming myself. My wife, though, told me that she was quite concerned. She said at times I even seemed manic, which I didn't notice. Mood swings would change rapidly, things I didn't notice. No one else gave me that feedback. So you got to listen and be open to what people say and see, because they may not. You may not yourself. So we tried to, initially, we tried to go down the approach we called the mixed orientation marriage. Okay, you stay together, basically. Then what do you do with that? And I actually found an online group called Husbands Out to Wives. How? It's a group of men who either have come out to their wife or agreed to within 6 months of joining this online group. I follow a lot of their stories. They have success. They have different approach, and you have to decide what works for yours and what doesn't for yours. In my case, that's not the path that we chose. In fact, because while we're not officially divorced, we have turned in our divorce, what do you call it, stipulation. Our attorneys have that and are just waiting for something else they're working on to resolve for them to actually submit that. But that's the path that we chose to do. But through that time, we worked through things as a couple, a lot of deep discussions, some superficial. You can imagine the emotion was always there. Both of us wanting to go back to the way it was because of the happiness we had and the positive family life. How could I do this? And from her perspective, how could I do this? That was a constant ongoing thing and understandable. So no fault again at hers at all. And then I started to meet some other individuals, reached out to a friend that when I'd worked at the university, I was no longer there, but I knew that he was an LGBTQ plus liaison from the police department to the student body. And I reached out to him because he was very open about his sexuality, and I'd probably describe himself more as his queerness, which to me, that's not a pejorative. I know for some, my generation, queer is. To me, homosexual is the pejorative because that was always part of the Defense Department. Are you a homosexual? And also when I was a kid, homosexuals were the ones that were going to molest you in restrooms. And so you had the warnings from your parents. So I do not like that term. I'd rather be gay. But I understand it's a term in the dictionary, so it shall be used. So I got some ideas of who else to talk to.
This is the point in the episode where I usually remind you that you can support Graying Rainbows on Patreon, but instead I'm going to prime you for the next bit of the interview. David is about to tell you about the First Friday Breakfast Club. So I want to mention that after we recorded this interview, I had the honor to speak to this group, and I will include the link to the Zoom video in the show notes at grayingrainbows.com.
There's a man called Jonathan Wilson who started something called the First Friday Breakfast Club. He outed himself when he was running for re-election to the school board in Des Moines, Iowa. He didn't like some of the policy, the way things were going. And he tells his own story. You can even see it on YouTube of how he outed himself to continue on, but then started this group of LGBTQ plus men. We meet once a month, have speakers of all types of information, a chance to socialize. Right now, we're not meeting in person. We're meeting on Zoom because of COVID, but he was good to talk to, someone who'd been down that path. He was even gracious and at an award ceremony he was being honored for his 20 years of service. He also was the executive director of the Victory Fund for a while in DC after he came out. He's an attorney, still is today, in fact, happily with a partner. But he introduced me to his ex-wife. She was very gracious. She extended herself to help me and my wife in any way possible, just to explain their journey and the outcome and things that she thought and went through and how she landed on her feet.
Did that help your wife? I would think it would be really important.
They never got together.
Oh, too bad. Did she find somebody else?
She's found others to talk to and has her own therapist. But it was just the fact of, finding people that are willing. Someone else you can or cannot, you may or may not accept the offer, but at least finding someone that's willing can be helpful in its own. I know it was for me, just knowing that was there. So now I'm to this kind of new reality at this point, that how can we operate and function as a family if I'm out or if I'm a gay man, acknowledged as a gay man to us as a couple, but yet what do I do with it? At this stage, we're trying to do we're talking about a mixed orientation marriage, but that just doesn't seem fair, but we're still working towards that path. Both of us genuinely that way. But I'm literally driving home from work that day, right after we'd had this conversation. I kid you not, there is a rainbow over our house. A rainbow over our house. I'm going, oh my God. It's almost, are you sure you're making the right decision? It was just too bizarre to see that. So then in August, I actually attended the First Friday Breakfast Club. They meet early in the morning and I'm driving, an hour away. So I'm leaving at, good griefs, before 6 o'clock in the morning to get there. And I must say, I felt so relaxed, so welcome. It was the first time I'd walked into a room and didn't have to worry about anything, nothing, not what I thought. And it's just a bunch of guys having breakfast, really interesting scrambled eggs and some fruit, listening to a speaker. In this case, it was the speaker had to do with the Rainbow Railroad, I believe it's called, which does a lot of helping getting folks out of countries where being gay, LGBTQ plus can be a life sentence of death to do that. So that was very compelling to hear that speaker talk about that. And also I had met a friend, Rich, and the husband's out to wife online to find out only that he lived in the same area I did, not too far away. So we agreed to actually meet together in the lobby where we have breakfast, kind of fortify ourselves. And we actually met at a table in the back of the room, met each other face to face because he was going through something about the same timeline I was, coming out to his wife, his family, and his children to do that. So that was just nice to have someone that I didn't know well, but had at least met through a text through that online group to find out that he actually lived in this community to do that. So by August now, I'd worked up with coming out to the kids. We decided that was important to do. Wrote a 4-page letter. Again, I'm a planner. I have to write it out. Didn't read it to them, but we met outside on the porch, went through and described the love and affection for children that we have for them as children. What this is, it's going to have some impact. Not sure what it means to our family or the marriage with my wife. Love and support was the theme, that they shouldn't, don't let this disrupt their studies because they're both in school. So we're concerned about that. One was about to graduate in December of that year. It was interesting and tearful sitting out there on that hot August evening. Both were quiet. The daughter teared up a bit. Found out after the fact. The tears were more of all of her friends. We were the last couple that were still married for the most part. And so she was hoping that she would always have the parents that would be together forever. And she saw that might not be a possibility. The son let out a big gasp and stood up. I thought, okay, what's going to happen here? Because he's not overly expressive by his personality. He's rather reserved, and gave me a big hug with a smile. And just he said it was okay, basically, that I just needed to be who I am. I was like, wow, not that I expected at all. And now both are very supportive and accepting in all ways that kids can be. We have beautiful conversations, and it just continues. In fact, so much so, I'll jump ahead and then I'll jump back a bit. When I was then visiting my son later in the year, I guess it was November, in Rochester, New York, where he was going to school, he wanted to know, how did I know that I was gay? And then we had a conversation. He then came out to me. So he identifies queer as a minimum, gay, somewhere in there. He's 23. So I think the power of my vulnerability and being open with my children allowed him, in his case, to be open and not have to go through what I did for all those years.
That must mean everything to you.
Yeah. And then I had another family member, not immediate family member, that I came out as well. So it rose. Later in that month, I met up with my friend Mark in DC on a sad note. The friend I talked about that was my Air Force friend, he actually had died the year before and was having his funeral at Arlington National Cemetery. It takes a year, basically, for your service to take place because of the logistics of all that. So we met there, and when he picked me up at the airport, he took me to something called a Mankind Project Coming Home ceremony. Mankind Project is a wonderful organization, MKP. Look it up. All you have to do is identify as a man. Gay, straight, trans, doesn't matter. Identify as a man. That's all that it is. All men around the world. Very strong organization. It's all run by volunteers primarily, except for about 5 people that run the national level to help us keep going. But it's locally done and distributed. So these men had been on what's called a New Warrior Training Adventure, NWTA, New Warrior Training Adventure. The concept is that men need a safe space to identify with men, that culturally we don't necessarily do that. And therefore, we're not in tune with ourselves, with others, our emotions and our feelings and the work that we need to do. So you go off on this, you go on a Friday night and you come home Sunday afternoon. And these men had done that weeks previously. And this was their coming home to reflect on how it had impacted them. This happened to be what's called a Gateway New Warrior Training Adventure. So this had the perspective of LGBTQ plus to have a safe space for those men to participate. That was just random. My friend had gone through this earlier in his life and actually had required his sons or his future son-in-laws to go through the same process just to understand themselves. And these guys were talking about this big change this weekend. And I said, really? I can't imagine that have that much insight into yourself and your psyche and who you are and what you're looking for in life and your challenges and the work you need to do. I said, really can? I said, oh yeah, okay, sure. I was doubting, in other words. Got home and talked to my therapist. Well, he was an advocate, had been through it himself. And we ended up that we had a weekend that year in October. And so I went and did the weekend. And oh my God, I couldn't believe it. Beautifully facilitated. The men that are the facilitators go through thousands of hours of training and personal expense. It's more of the coaching model, coaching with direct focus, intent short, get to the point, 25 men, and then the staff maybe twice as many as the men that are participating. It was beautiful, exhausting, powerful, made friendships there that will endure forever. And we don't even live in the same town. And then when you get home, you then join with your local group of men that have been through that. Here in Des Moines, we have a rather small core group of guys that have been through that together. And then we take in other men too that can join us, especially with COVID, since there aren't other options really for them. And that has been one of the biggest support things. So when I talked about family therapists and the friends, I have that extended friends in my MKP group, which is incredible. In fact, I'm even taking an MKP online course right now. It's called Ask and Tell. It's a group coaching with 10 men and 2 facilitators, and we're all LGBTQ plus men, meet for 2 hours every Tuesday for 8 weeks or so. Beautifully intense, and again, part of the self-help. Through this whole process, I've learned you have to be open to identifying all aspects of yourself. You just can't figure, oh, I'm straight today, I'm gay tomorrow, life will be good. If you do that, I think you're going to have some pain. You're going to pain regardless, but I think you might be confused, and I'm new into this, so I'm not an expert. I'm just giving you my personal experience and the way I do business, but I would recommend find something like that. And then with the First Friday Breakfast Club that I mentioned earlier, I'm now on the board for that, which has been helpful as well. And one of the things we do is not just speakers. We then award scholarships to about 7 to 8 graduating high school students each year that advocate for inclusion and fight against homophobic responses in life. And it's amazing. They can be of any perspective, gay, straight themselves, doesn't matter. You just have to have those values and demonstrate them through their actions and through what they do. And these kids are incredible. When you read their submissions and listen to them. Last year, our award ceremony was over Zoom, so it was not quite as fulfilling as doing it in person. And it's sometimes when our member representing the club will go to the assembly. In some cases, that may be the first, for a while, maybe not as much now, the first gay person that they've seen in person speaking to a group because of the town that they come from or the area that they do. And that kind of gets to today. So we've decided not to stay married. We've essentially filed for our divorce. She's moved to another state. I moved closer to work. In this last October, National Coming Out Day, I came out online. Why not? In this day and age, wrote my story, not to get praise or adulation, but ended up getting lots of praise and adulation and support. Like I said, I've received no negative direct responses to my coming out. I've been just blown away by people I respect, great respect. I worked for senior officers and officials that publicly supported me, folks that privately support me at every turn. The mission continues. It's not complete by any means. It continues on and on and on. I doubt that it'll ever end. I heard that a lot as the coming out story actually is one that never does end because your situation in life changes, your associations with people. But the major takeaway is find a good friend, find professional help, find some things to throw yourself into. For example, with my Mankind Project, we all have a mission statement, and that mission statement helps keep me focused about leading a life of authenticity and with compassion and integrity. I even changed my license plate. It's authentic, AUTHNTC, because that's the way I need to be in my daily life. So that's a story of where I am today.
Well, David, thanks so much for sharing. One thing you didn't mention that I feel like I need to ask is, since you're still early on in the process, I've gotten a lot of emails from people, obviously in the last year, that with COVID, it's really, for those just coming out, been making things worse. I mean, like, I got a letter from a person in Australia who said that they had planned to do a year of travel. They just came out and then they were going to go and travel, and now they were just stuck. It sounds like with you had some things going on and you've been able to do some online things, but it's really hard to actually meet someone in the circumstances that we are still facing today, right?
It is, yes. I was fortunate that I did have ongoing things, like with my Mankind Project. We do an online group that we actually posted on Meetup, and that's for anybody. So it's not just, it's anybody. So I have at least personal connection there and making, I feel like, a difference through First Friday Breakfast Club there as well. And then I do have, I talked about the one friend that I have that is similar in the path and timeline. We then have other friends. And so I've reached out and I have friends that are mentor friends. I talked to my therapist last week. I said, COVID in some way has been a blessing because I haven't had the pressure to try to move to the social aspects, but it's given me the time to go through some of the intellectual piece to be better prepared and understanding. And that's one of the reactions I get from some friends, is that they're surprised, but yet they're pleased that I'm taking this time to think about all this intellectually and not just, running out in the world and say, okay, where do I go meet? I've heard other guests talk about that, where it's not, yes, it's a sexual orientation, but it's not about just the sex. It is a mental perspective. In fact, that was in what I wrote to kids, is that this has to do with the way I perceive the world and the way I interact in the world. And it's not necessarily just about sexual orientation. It's just the way I view things. It's the way I was born. It's not something I decided. It's just the perspective that's encoded in me. And therefore, I've spent all this, as you can tell, really in my head, understanding emotions, response, challenges, weaknesses, opportunities, with the hope that when COVID is lifted, I will be more confident and assured in myself and in living in my skin and accepting myself and going through all this doubt with friends, family, and professional help, coaches, is that when I do come out, I will be able to take more advantage of that and to flourish. Because the one thing, when I was married, I did honor the marriage vows. So there was no experimentation and engagement. So I'm using this time to actually get into the headspace so I can then just be more confident and assured and not angst filled.
I love hearing about the Mankind Project because you pointed out that it's not just gay men, it's all kinds of men. I think that is so important. And one of the things that perhaps as mature adults entering the LGBT plus community that we have to offer, which is we don't need to be like segregated off from the straight community. You know, a lot of young people seem to have this us and them approach, and that's not healthy.
No, not at all. No. MKP is wonderful. In fact, yeah, I'm in my group, local group, I'm the minority. I'm usually the only LGBTQ person there. We've got a few other men that could be there, but are not there regularly. But that's not why I'm there. I'm there to identify and work through things with other men. And when we do work, we actually do work. Each time we meet for 2 hours, you identify one bit of work you want to do. It could be on anything, a relationship, a thought. It's like a coaching thing where someone's then helping you kind of work through that, not to solve it, but just get you to another level of understanding so you can continue to percolate on it when you're not there, when you're sleeping, when you're brushing your teeth, when you're doing your workout.
That sounds like it could be a great resource to all the man-identified listeners to the show. I mean, I intentionally make sure that this show is for everyone.
There is a women's version of that, but I'm not as familiar, and I get the name wrong sometimes. Women Within, I believe, is how it's portrayed. When I get the term wrong, sometimes it shows up as a women's clothing thing.
Well, I think I can probably figure it out. I want to back up and ask you something about the Air Force. You mentioned that, you know, you were really shy, the guy behind the plant, and how yet you became a general. And I'm curious about this because my sister retired after 25 years and she was a colonel. I think she secretly wanted to be a general, but she had some health issues that derailed her. But she was the same personality. I mean, really basically a shy person, yet went into the Air Force and went into leadership and did really well. Is that very common?
Very common. When you do the Myers-Briggs, a lot of us are INTJs, you know, so the introvert, checklist oriented, get it done person. But I joke that I used to tell my folks, I have a switch behind my left ear. And when I need to be an extrovert, I just turn that switch on and then I can be very engaging. I've got to give leadership direction, provide inspiration, rally, whatever we're doing, the airmen to whatever the cause is. And they're the ones that will make success, not me. My job is to provide the inspiration, the motivation, and the resources, and then get the heck out of the way. And they are so damn good. The children of our national citizens are incredible and will surprise you if you give them the opportunity. And I think that's why a lot of the senior leaders, why some are really extroverted, there's a lot more than you'd expect introverted, because that's the power, is our introversion to allow others to actually excel at whatever their perspective is and not try to impose our perspective on them.
Have you ever seen the movie Serving in Silence with Glenn Close? It's about Colonel Camomire. I think that's how you say her name.
No, I have not.
It was a movie made back in the 90s, but Glenn Close plays the woman who was kicked out of the Air Force because she actually said yes to the question about homosexuality when she was trying to get a security clearance, because she wanted to be a general and she wanted to go to the War College, and she felt like it would be dishonorable to lie. And that was the beginning of the end. She actually eventually was reinstated, but I just watched a documentary yesterday called Surviving in Silence. And it's about her and another woman who was also a colonel. They were both nurses. That's pretty much how it was back then. But I don't know how you get to that documentary, but it's really a good one. And I think they estimated, some huge number of people who lost their careers. And one of the things that they mentioned that I wanted to put into this episode was that, you know, now people that were dishonorably discharged can have that appealed and fixed. And there's an organization called modernmilitary.org. Basically, that's its purpose, is to help people how to get their discharge changed from dishonorable to honorable. I mean, there were even people who were lost their benefits after they retired because they were outed. which meant that you had to be in the closet even after you got out because you'd be worrying about losing your benefits. I mean, I can imagine my sister without her benefits. She'd be financially devastated.
For me, when I was serving, again, this was never in my head of being gay. So I feel that I answered all those questions correctly and honorably.
Honestly, right.
Honestly. So I never felt I was deceiving. It was through further introspection many years later.
But when Mark David Gibson was on, he was also in the Don't Ask, Don't Tell generation. He almost committed suicide as a serviceman because of that situation.
Now I'm, in fact, trying to reach out as what I can do. That's what I do. I'm passionate about things. So how can I become totally enveloped in something? And I see this now as, how do I help others? I had the benefit of engaging briefly with Eric Marcus, who does Making Gay History. He had a podcast when I was out digging in our yard, and I heard one of the folks on an episode, Barbara Gettings and Kayla Husen, talking about how they were working with trying to get the homosexuality removed from DSM. And they said, if we have one person in Iowa who is encouraged by hearing somebody stand up for us, then that's good. And I'm thinking, so many years later, I'm that one person in Iowa hearing that. And so when he was doing thanks at the end of an episode, he said he wanted to thank retired Air Force General David Cotton, who hopes that sharing his military rank, others might feel encouraged by his indirect example to realize it's okay to be who you are. And I was surprised by him just briefly saying that at the end of an episode. I got an email from an Air Force lieutenant colonel who's married to a husband. How different is that? Here it is, two men married. He's an Air Force lieutenant colonel, and he's actually mentoring members of the military to pursue a commission. So we have a broader, more diverse force. And he said that now when you have a military function, your plus one could be someone of the same gender, which when I was in the military, oh my God, that would have been instant, suspicion. The perception was the suspicion of being LGBTQ plus was the end of your career.
Because it was.
Yeah, it was.
I don't know what it was like for the men because I've read more about the lesbian side of the story. But for lesbians, they could be accused. They didn't even have to have any proof, and they could be kicked out.
I dreaded as a unit commander that someone would bring allegations to me because I often went through, because I didn't believe in it as a policy. What would I do? I'd follow the policy, but fortunately, I never had that situation, never had to deal with it. And in General Clapper's book that he wrote after he left the administration, the last administration, or I guess 2 administrations ago now, he writes about that as well, where he didn't, I can remember the exact wording, but had concerns as well about don't ask, don't tell, and how to support all that from a human perspective.
Well, fortunately, attitudes have changed, and I'm sure that there's probably a few old fogey generals, excepting you, of course, who still think the old way of looking at things because, let's face it, the military skews conservative, which means there have to be some people with very conservative religious beliefs.
Well, we say that too, but you'll be surprised that it doesn't skew as much as people think when you're on the inside.
Well, all I know is that when my sister went into the Air Force, she became more conservative. But then she became part of Christians Against Trump.
I think because we get a cross-section of society.
Yep. But without the draft, it's not as cross-section as it was when we had the draft.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I sort of got off topic there. But like I said, I just watched that documentary and it was really compelling. And I have to figure out a way to share it with everybody. Well, I will ask you my sort of standard question that I ask most people, which is, so far, what has been the biggest surprise?
The power of vulnerability and being open, honest with myself and others, and how that has then been I'd say the snowball effect, but one thing to the other by that, being vulnerable with friends, family, yourself, and then being accepting of that, and how that while there are negatives, there are positives too in all that you can. I was surprised by that. I really was.
I think that's a big one. David, is there anything else you want to share before we close?
Just to reiterate, find a good friend, professional help, find a cause to focus your attention, and hopefully it's a cause that can help you like I've done with the Mankind Project. I really recommend that for all men, regardless what your focus is, and other things to channel and figure out what your purpose and function is. It's not just about you, it impacts others. So how can you minimize that impact and help in your relationships there as well. And I have a long list of resources I'm willing to share with you of the tons of books that I read, sites I went to, podcasts I listened to, if any of the listeners want to see some of those same things. And you may have shared them before, but
yeah, well, that sounds good. Maybe we can work together to figure out a way to put that stuff in a place where it's going to be easy for people to find. Obviously, we can put it in the show notes, but if you've got a lot of stuff, we may need to link to something else. But we'll work on that together before this interview goes live.
And thank you again for all that you do to provide this platform for people to find you. And again, while they may not reach out to you, my guess is that you're helping more than you realize.
I hear from enough people that I know that it makes a difference. And like you said, that's what you need. You need to have a project where you can make a difference. We all need that. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.
I want to thank retired Brigadier General David Cotton for sharing his story with us. For me, his story is a powerful reminder of why I started Graying Rainbows. In a world where people are coming out LGBT+, even before they hit puberty, it's important to remember that many of us grew up in a time when we could not even acknowledge the possibility to ourselves, let alone the rest of the world. David did a great job of sharing his journey and modeling how one can be both strong and vulnerable at the same time. I want to reiterate what he said about the importance of finding someone to talk to, whether it's a counselor or a close friend or both. He mentioned several resources today, and I will include those in the show notes at grayingrainbows.com. That's also where you can find additional episodes of the podcast, and you can also subscribe or follow Graying Rainbows in your favorite audio app. If you want to get show notes automatically, sign up for our free newsletter on the website, in the show notes, or text Graying Rainbows to 33777. Spell Graying Rainbows as all one word and with an A. Graying Rainbows to 33777. I'm always looking for listeners who want to share their story on the show. And of course, you just email me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. I'm also thinking about compiling a book of people's stories, since we've all had the experience of looking in vain for books that reflect the experience of coming out LGBT+ later in life. The core of the book is likely to be stories from the podcast, but if you're interested in sharing your story without coming on the show, you can also email me. This project is in its early planning stage, so don't hesitate to reach out to me no matter when you hear this episode. Before I close, I want to talk about our private group on MeWe. We moved from Facebook in 2020 to provide better privacy for those who need it. You can learn about MeWe's privacy policies at MeWe.com. You need an invitation to join, so just send me an email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. And don't forget to actually post on the group if you're a member. If you don't want to post something private, you can always talk about the latest episode. Finally, I really want to thank those of you who are supporting Graying Rainbows via Patreon at patreon.com/Graying Rainbows. You can also support my work by buying my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty, from your favorite online store or from brainsciencepodcast.com. And of course, I hope that you'll share Graying Rainbows with others. I'll be back next month with another interview. Until then, please check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas. Graying Rainbows is copyright 2021 to Dr. Virginia Campbell. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.